The boardroom of the Galactic Coalition Academy felt cold that morning. Colder than usual, even by the standards of the climate-controlled station that orbited the peaceful world of Sanctuary. Prime Cadet Jake Torres stood at attention in the center of the semicircular chamber, while 7 instructors from 5 different species sat in judgment above him, their various faces showing expressions that ranged from disappointment to barely concealed satisfaction. This was his 3rd violation in as many months, and the instructors had clearly reached the end of their patience with the young human instructor Velkas, a towering Valkyrie with blue-gray skin and 4 thoughtful eyes, reviewed the charges from a holographic display that floated before her. Long fingers, unauthorized modification of Academy training simulations, disregard for established safety protocols, and she paused, her translator converting her whistling speech into standard coalition tongue. What you called making things more exciting. When confronted about your actions, Jake said nothing because speaking without permission would only make things worse. Though part of him wanted to explain that the simulation had been far too easy, and that his modifications had actually improved the learning outcomes for his entire cohort. The other instructors knew this too, which was why they looked so frustrated rather than simply angry. Instructor Thrennis, a Threnny whose species prided itself on following every rule ever written and several that existed only in theoretical form, leaned forward with all 3 of his primary manipulator arms crossed over his chest. The human problem, Thrennis began in his clicking, precise voice, is not one of capability but of respect for authority. Respect for procedures that keep cadets alive. Respect for the centuries of institutional knowledge that built this academy. Jay kept his eyes forward and his mouth shut, though internally he disagreed with about 70% of what Thrennis had just said. The truth was that humans had only been part of the Galactic Coalition for 30 years, and the Academy still treated them like dangerous children who needed constant supervision. Every simulation was designed for species that evolved on low-gravity worlds with sparse predators and abundant resources. Species that found the idea of unnecessary risk completely alien to their psychology. For a human from Earth, a world the Coalition had classified as a TIV, Class 7 death world, before humanity achieved spaceflight. The training felt like kindergarten with extra steps. We have debated extensively about the appropriate response to your repeated violations, Velkas continued, her voice carrying a note of finality that made Jake's stomach tighten slightly. Expulsion was considered, but your academic scores and physical performance are exceptional, and the Coalition's treaty with Earth requires us to provide equal educational opportunities. Jake allowed himself the smallest sense of relief before Velkas continued. However, we cannot allow such behavior to continue without significant consequences. Which brings us to your punishment assignment. A holographic image materialized in the center of the room, showing a planet that looked like someone had taken Earth's most dangerous ecosystems and combined them with an alien nightmare. Purple and green continents sprawled across dark oceans, and even from orbit the massive storm systems in strange atmospheric patterns looked hostile. This is Kalo 7, announced Instructor Mira, a usually kind Zentari whose furred face now showed unusual sternness. It is classified as a point of no-return world, which means that establishing any permanent presence there has proven impossible for every species that has attempted it. The hologram zoomed in to show dense forests of twisted vegetation, rivers that flowed with thick amber liquid, and the brief glimpse of something massive moving through the undergrowth. The atmosphere is technically breathable for most coalition species, including humans, Velkas added, but it contains spores that cause severe psychological disturbances, hallucinations, paranoia, and in some cases complete mental breakdown. Thrennis picked up the explanation with obvious satisfaction in his voice. The wildlife consists entirely of apex predators, There is no concept of prey animals on Kalos 7 because every creature evolved to hunt, and many of them are capable of breaching military-grade armor. Jake studied the hologram with genuine interest rather than fear, which seemed to disappoint Threnus somewhat. 17 different Coalition species have attempted to establish research stations on Kalos 7 over the past 2 centuries. Mira continued sadly. Every single attempt ended in either emergency evacuation or complete loss of contact with the research teams. Velka stood, her full height impressive even by the standards of her tall species. You will spend 3 months on Kalos 7. Cadet Taurus, with minimal supplies and limited communication capacity. You may send distress signals which we will monitor, but we will only extract you in case of life-threatening emergency. She paused to let that sink in before adding, this punishment serves 2 purposes. It removes you from the academy environment where your behavior influences other cadets, and it provides you with time to contemplate whether following established protocols might actually serve a purpose. Jake finally spoke, his voice steady despite the weight of what they were describing. I understand and accept the punishment assignment. The instructors exchanged glances, clearly expecting more resistance, or perhaps pleading. Humans were known for their emotional responses, yet this one seemed almost eager. You leave in 6 hours, Threnus said with a dismissive gesture. Report to Base 7 for supply distribution and transport assignment dismissed. Jake saluted in the Coalition style, fist to chest, and turned on his heel to leave the boardroom behind him. He could hear the instructors already beginning to debate whether 3 months was too harsh. But Jake's mind was elsewhere. He had reviewed the files on Kalos 7 during his last visit to the Academy's restricted database, a visit that was itself technically unauthorized, but had never been discovered. The planet was dangerous, certainly, but danger was relative. Earth had lions, bears, crocodiles, sharks, venomous snakes, and spiders, and humans had not only survived but thrived by learning to understand and adapt to their environment. The Coalition species saw Kalos 7 as an impossible nightmare because they had never needed to develop the skills that every human child learned from stories about their ancestors. How to read animal behavior, how to find shelter and food in hostile environments, how to turn disadvantages into advantages through creativity and persistence. As Jake made his way through the Academy's curved corridors toward his quarters to pack, he felt something that the instructors would have found deeply concerning had they known he felt excited. 3 months alone on a death world with no supervision, no protocols, and no one telling him that his approach to problems was too risky or unconventional. 3 months to explore, to learn, to test himself against an environment that had defeated 17 different species. The other cadets he passed in the hallway whispered and pointed, already having heard about his punishment through the Academy's efficient rumor network. They looked at him with pity, assuming he was marching towards certain death or madness. Jake just smiled and kept walking, already planning what gear he would need and what his first priorities would be upon landing. The instructors thought they were teaching him a lesson about the dangers of breaking protocol. What they did not understand was that they had just given him exactly what every human secretly craved: a real challenge. The shuttle descent through Kalos 7's atmosphere had been rough, with winds that buffeted the small craft like a toy, and clouds that seemed to reach up toward the ship with grasping tendrils of purple and green. Jake had piloted it manually rather than trusting the automated systems, and when the shuttle finally touched down in a clearing beside one of the amber rivers, he sat for a moment appreciating the simple fact that he had arrived in one piece. The cargo door hissed open and the smell of Kalos 7 hit him immediately, something like cinnamon mixed with ozone, and underneath it all a musky scent that spoke of living things, many living things, all of them probably interested in whether he was food. He stepped out onto soil that was darker than Earth's, almost black and springy under his boots. The gravity was slightly higher than standard, maybe 1.2 times Earth normal, which felt almost comfortable after months on the Academy's light gravity station. The clearing around him was surrounded by forest, if you could call it that. The trees were twisted things with bark that looked like overlapping scales and leaves that seemed to track his movement with unsettling attention. Jake unloaded his supplies quickly, keeping one eye on the tree line and one hand near the plasma cutter that the Academy had grudgingly included in his kit. Survival pack contained basics: a shelter pod that would deploy into a small sealed tent, water purification tablets, standard ration bars that tasted like cardboard, regardless of which flavor the package claimed, a basic medical kit, and the communications array. The communications array was particularly interesting because while it could receive his transmissions back to the Academy, it was locked into one-way mode. They could hear his distress calls, but would not be sending encouraging messages or advice. Jake smiled at that because it meant he could essentially do whatever he wanted without them nagging him about safety protocols. The first night he stayed inside the shelter pod, listening to the sounds of Kalo 7's ecosystem waking up around him. Things howled, things shrieked, things made sounds that his brain could not quite categorize because Earth had no equivalent. The shelter sensors detected movement around the perimeter at least 40 times during the night, and twice something large enough to trigger the proximity alarm sniffed around the entrance. Before moving on, one morning came and morning on. Kalo 7 was a gradual brightening of the purple sky to a lighter lavender color. Jake emerged to find tracks in the dark soil around his shelter. Some were clearly made by something that walked on four legs with claws that dug deep furrows. Others looked almost like handprints, except with too many fingers. And one set appeared to be from something that slithered, but also had legs, which seemed biologically confusing. He spent the first day exploring a careful radius around his landing site, mapping the terrain and observing the local wildlife from what he hoped was a safe distance. The Amber River turned out to be teeming with life, and when he cautiously tested the water with his portable analysis kit, he discovered it was actually safe to drink after filtration, though it had a mineral content that would make it taste strange. The real discovery came when he saw his first razor eel. He had been sitting by the riverbank, eating one of the tasteless ration bars and watching the water flow, when something erupted from the depths. The creature was easily 6 meters long, its body a mass of writhing muscle, covered in scales that looked like they had been carved from dark glass. Its mouth opened to reveal rows of teeth that were indeed razor-sharp and positioned in a way that suggested anything caught in that bite would not be getting free. The eel had been chasing something smaller, and it caught its prey in a spray of amber water before disappearing back into the depths. Jake sat very still for several minutes after that, processing what he had seen and recalculating his danger assessment of the river. That night, he moved his shelter to higher ground. By the third day, Jake had established a routine: wake before dawn, check the perimeter, scout a different direction each day, return before dusk, and seal himself in the shelter while Kalo 7's nocturnal predators went about their business. He had also started to notice patterns in the wildlife behavior. The tracks that appeared around his shelter each night were always in the same sequence. The four-legged clawed creature came first, then the handprint maker, then the slithering but also walking thing. They were following each other. He realized, like a patrol route, the creatures were not randomly wandering. They were checking established territory. This was actually good news, because territorial behavior was predictable, and predictable behavior could be worked with on the morning of the third day. Jake made a decision. He set up the communications array positioned himself by the river with the best lighting, and activated the recording function. His face appeared on the small screen, and he checked to make sure the camera was capturing both him and the scenic view of the Amber River behind him. "Hey everyone," he began, keeping his voice casual and friendly. "Jake here. Day 3 on Kalo 7, so I know you guys sent me here to think about my life choices. But check this out." He turned the camera to show the river, where he had spent the last hour carefully placing chunks of his least favorite ration bars along the shore. The local waterways are packed with these things I'm calling razor eels 6 meters long. Teeth like broken glass, supposedly super aggressive according to the Academy's files. He demonstrated by tossing a large chunk of the ration bar into the water near one of his bait piles. The response was immediate. A razor eel launched itself from the river, its body coiling in the air as its jaws snapped shut on the food. The creature's scales caught the purple-tinged sunlight and gleamed like polished obsidian. "Beautiful, right?" Jake narrated, keeping the camera steady. "But here's the thing about apex predators from high-gravity death worlds. They're actually pretty straightforward once you understand their body language." He had spent hours the previous day just watching the eels, noting how they moved differently when hunting versus when defending territory, how they would make a specific ripple pattern in the water before attacking, how they avoided certain areas of the river where the current was strongest. See how it approached from downstream and struck from the right side. That's because the current helps it maneuver. And they prefer to keep their dominant side, which appears to be their right toward the prey. Jake continued explaining his observations, describing how he had been practicing what he called catch and release by using a reinforced line from his shelter support, cables and hooks fashioned from bent pieces of his equipment. Crady had actually managed to hook 2 eels, let them fight for a moment, and then release them unharmed. The process had taught him more about their behavior in 10 minutes than all the Academy's files combined. "Anyway," he concluded, turning the camera back to himself, "I figured I'd document this. Think of it as my survival blog. Or maybe a nature documentary, whatever works." He smiled at the camera, knowing that back at the Academy the instructors would be watching this transmission with confusion and probably concern. Planet's pretty interesting once you stop thinking of it as trying to kill you and start thinking of it as just, a place with its own ecosystem that follows logical rules, same as anywhere else. He ended the transmission and uploaded it to the communications array, which would boost it back to the Academy on the next scheduled window. Then Jake returned to his fishing spot, because there was still a lot to learn about razor eels, and he had 3 months to figure it all out back on the Academy station. In the monitoring room where communications from punishment assignments were reviewed, a junior technician nearly choked on her morning beverage when Jake's transmission came through. She immediately forwarded it to the board of instructors with a message that simply read, "You need to see this within an hour." All 7 instructors who had sentenced Jake Torres to Kalo 7 were gathered around a display screen, watching in silent disbelief as the human calmly explained predator behavior while sitting beside a river full of creatures that had killed 3 trained xenobiologists during the last research. Expedition Valis spoke first, her voice uncertain in a way that her students had never heard. "He is fishing. He's literally fishing on a Class 7 death world." Threnis made a sound like grinding gears, which was how his species expressed deep confusion. "This violates every expected outcome." The psychological evaluation suggested he would last perhaps 2 weeks before requesting emergency extraction. Instructor Mira rewound the transmission to the part where Jake casually mentioned practicing catch and release with the razor eels. "He has been intentionally interacting with the apex predators," she said, quietly, "not avoiding them, not hiding from them, but studying them like they are simply large fish. The instructors looked at each other, and in that moment they began to understand that they had made a significant miscalculation about both Kalo 7 and about human psychology. The planet that had defeated 17 different species was not defeating Jake Torres because he refused to approach it as an enemy to survive against. He was approaching it as a neighbor to understand, and that made all the difference. The transmissions from Kalo 7 became a regular occurrence over the following 2 weeks, arriving every 3 to 4 days like clockwork. Each one documented a different aspect of Jake's increasingly comfortable existence on a planet that the Coalition had classified as utterly hostile to sentient life. The 4th transmission showed Jake demonstrating how to identify and avoid the hallucinogenic spores by watching the behavior of small flying creatures he called sky mites. When the mites flew in tight, spiraling patterns, it meant spore clouds were present in the upper atmosphere, and he should stay in covered areas. The 5th transmission featured Jake's discovery of a fungus that grew on the north side of the scale bark trees, which when properly prepared was not only edible but actually tasted better than the ration bars. Though he admitted that this was setting a very low bar for comparison. 6th transmission included detailed observations about predator hierarchies, showing how the 4-legged creatures he called ridgebacks would defer to the larger slithering hunters, and how both species avoided certain territories during specific times of day. By the 7th transmission, the Academy instructors had stopped being surprised and started being genuinely concerned, because Jake did not just look healthy. He looked like he was thriving. His shelter had expanded from the basic pod into a more elaborate structure, using local materials woven together with impressive skill. His face showed color from spending time in Kalo 7's purple-tinged sunlight, and he had actually gained visible muscle mass from the higher gravity and increased physical activity. Then came the 8th transmission, and everything changed. The video opened with Jake's face filling the frame. But something was different about his expression. He looked excited in a way that made the instructors lean forward despite themselves. Okay, so this one is pretty incredible. Jake began without his usual casual preamble. I need to tell you about Nix. He turned the camera around, and the instructors collectively made sounds of alarm in their various languages behind Jake. Clearly visible in the light of his campfire was a dusk render. The Academy Xenobiology database contained extensive files on dusk renders because they were considered one of the most dangerous predator species ever cataloged. Adults could reach 3 meters at the shoulder, their bodies covered in overlapping scales that were nearly impervious to standard weapons, and they hunted in coordinated packs that demonstrated tactical intelligence. The Coalition's only previous encounter with dusk renders had resulted in the loss of an entire survey team when they accidentally wandered into nesting territory. This particular dusk render was massive, even by the standards of its species, with scales the color of polished obsidian and bioluminescent patterns running along its spine that pulsed in slow rhythmic waves. Its head was currently resting on the ground near Jake's legs, and as the camera focused, the creature opened one eye, an eye that glowed with the same blue-green light as the patterns on its back, and regarded the camera with what could only be described as sleepy contentment. Everyone, meet Nix, Jake said, reaching down to scratch behind what appeared to be the creature's ear equivalent. Dusk render made a sound like distant thunder mixed with a cat's purr, and its bioluminescent patterns pulsed brighter for a moment. She was hunting me for like 2 days straight, Jake continued conversationally, as if discussing a minor inconvenience rather than a life-threatening pursuit. Respect. Honestly, because I had to get creative with the evasion. She's fast. She's smart. and she can track scent trails over distances that seem impossible. He panned the camera to show the surrounding forest, but then on the second day, I heard this sound. Kind of a distress call. And my stupid human brain decided I needed to investigate rather than, using the opportunity to put more distance between myself and the thing trying to eat me. Jake walked the camera to a spot about 20 meters from the campfire where the ground showed signs of recent collapse. Turns out Nyx got her front leg caught in a collapsed burrow. These things are all over Kalo 7, probably made by some kind of underground dwelling creature. He described how he had found the dusk render stuck, thrashing and making sounds of frustration and pain. The logical choice, the safe choice, would have been to leave or even to take advantage of the predator's vulnerable state. But here's the thing, Jake said, his voice carrying genuine emotion. I looked at her and I saw what my ancestors must have seen when they first encountered wolves. Not just a predator, but a potential partner. He explained his approach. Slow, cautious, speaking in calm tones while he assessed the situation. The dusk render had been wary but also clearly in pain. And when Jake began carefully removing the collapsed earth and stone from around its trapped leg, the creature had gone still. It took about 2 hours. Jake narrated, I had to be really careful because even injured she could have killed me in about half a second if she decided I was a threat. But she didn't. She just watched me work, and when I finally got her leg free, she pulled it out, tested her weight on it, and then just looked at me. The camera returned to the present, showing Nyx still resting comfortably by the fire. She didn't leave. She followed me back to camp. Kept her distance at first, but gradually got closer. Turns out dusk renders are actually pretty social creatures, which makes sense for pack hunters. Jake sat down beside the massive predator, and the camera captured the sheer size difference between human and beast. We've got this whole partnership going now. I help her with some of the bigger prey because those armored salamander things are tough even for a dusk render. And she keeps the smaller predators away from my camp. He demonstrated by tossing a piece of meat toward Nyx, who caught it in jaws that could have easily closed around Jake's entire torso. I've been observing her behavior, and I think most of Kalo 7's wildlife operates on pack dynamics that interspecies cooperation can actually exploit. These creatures aren't mindless killing machines. They're sophisticated social hunters who understand reciprocity and mutual benefit. Jake spent the next 10 minutes detailing his theories about dusk render communication, showing how Nyx would change the patterns of her bioluminescence to indicate different emotional states. Rapid pulsing meant alertness or excitement. Slow waves meant contentment, and sharp flashes seemed to be warnings. He also demonstrated the range of vocalization she could make, from the purring thunder sound to sharp barks that meant she had detected something in the perimeter, to a low humming that she made when she wanted attention. The transmission ended with Jake signing off casually while Nyx's massive head rested against his shoulder, her bioluminescent patterns creating a peaceful glow in the gathering darkness. Back on the Academy station, the monitoring room was in chaos. Velkas had her head in her hands, all four eyes closed as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. Renus was accessing the xenobiology database with frantic motions, searching for any precedent of a dusk render forming a bond with another species. The search returned 0 results. Instructor Mira was the first to speak, her voice barely above a whisper. He domesticated an apex predator. In 2 weeks, he has done what our best xenobiologists said was theoretically impossible. Not domesticated, corrected Velkas without looking up. Domestication takes generations. He has formed a partnership, which might actually be more impressive because it suggests intelligence and choice on both sides. The head of xenobiology, who had been called in to consult, was reviewing the footage with an expression of pure academic hunger. The implications are staggering if dusk renders are capable of forming interspecies bonds this quickly. Then our entire classification system for Death World predators needs revision. Thrennis finally spoke, his voice tight with something that might have been anger or might have been fear. This is supposed to be a punishment. He is supposed to be learning respect for proper protocols and procedures. Instead, he is making nature documentaries and befriending creatures that have killed trained professionals. The head of xenobiology turned to look at Thrennis with an expression that suggested the instructor was missing the point entirely. With respect, what Cadet Torres is demonstrating is exactly what proper protocol should look like for humans. His species evolved alongside predators and learned to work with them, rather than simply fleeing or fighting. This is human protocol. We just never bothered to understand it. Vulcas finally looked up, her eyes haunted. We sent him to Kalo 7 to break his spirit, she said quietly. Instead, we have given him exactly the environment where human instincts and capabilities shine. We have not punished him. We have freed him. The monitoring room fell silent except for the sound of the communications array receiving the next scheduled data packet from the planet's surface. No one wanted to check what it contained, because they were beginning to fear that each new transmission would reveal just how much more adaptable and capable the human cadet was than any of them had imagined. On Kalo 7, Jake Torres sat by his fire with Nick sleeping beside him, her massive body radiating warmth and her bioluminescent patterns creating dancing shadows in the forest. In the distance he could hear the calls of other dusk renders, and Nick's ear twitched in recognition, but she did not move. She had made her choice, and Jake had made his. The Death World was becoming home, and the monster was becoming. The Academy's emergency session was called at what would have been midnight station time, though in space such distinctions were largely arbitrary. What was not arbitrary was the severity of the situation that had prompted administrators from 3 different departments to gather in the secure conference room normally reserved for discussions of classified military research. The Corthax, a Xanthari administrator whose fur had gone silver with age and stress, stood at the head of the table with an expression that could curdle milk across multiple species biology. We have a situation, he began without preamble, activating the holographic display. One of our junior communications technicians, who has since been reassigned to far less sensitive duties, leaked Cadet Torres's transmissions to the public network. The display showed view counts that were climbing even as they watched. Jake's fishing vlog from Kalo 7 had been shared across coalition networks, reposted, commented on, and dissected by millions of beings from dozens of different worlds. The first transmission has been viewed 47 million times. Corthax continued, his voice strained. The one with the dusk render has exceeded 90 million views and is currently trending as the #1 topic on 6 major information networks. Vulcas, who had been called from her scheduled rest period, looked at the numbers with mounting horror. This is a disaster. When the council learns that we sent a cadet to a death world as punishment, and he not only survived but became famous for it. It gets worse, interrupted Thrennis, which caused everyone to turn toward him. Because Thrennis interrupting anyone was unprecedented, he brought up a compilation of response videos that beings across the coalition had posted. Species that the Academy had never even heard of were discussing Jake's techniques, his observations about predator behavior, his casual approach to extreme danger. Perhaps most damning were the videos from other humans, both military personnel and civilians, who were praising Jake's actions and pointing out that his behavior was not exceptional by human standards, but rather perfectly normal for someone with basic wilderness survival training. The humans are angry. Thresh said flatly. They're saying that we do not understand their species, that our training is inadequate for their needs, and that if a single cadet with minimal supplies can thrive on a Class 7 death world, then perhaps our planetary classification system is fundamentally flawed. The head of xenobiology, Professor Mira, brought up her own analysis. I have been reviewing every second of Torres's transmissions with my team, and we have reached some concerning conclusions. She displayed a breakdown of Jake's survival strategies. He is not doing anything. Impossible nothing that violates known physics or biology. He is simply applying a level of environmental adaptation and risk tolerance that no other coalition species would ever consider attempting. Her presentation showed comparison charts between human evolutionary history and that of other coalition species. Humans evolved as persistence hunters on a world with extreme environmental variability, numerous apex predators, and constant resource competition. Their entire psychology is built around the assumption that their environment is actively hostile and must be either overcome or befriended. Mira highlighted specific moments from Jake's videos, his approach to the trapped dusk render, his systematic observation of predator behavior, his willingness to experiment with local food sources. He treats Kalo 7 not as an alien death trap, but as a challenging camping trip because to human psychology, this is the natural state of existence. Struggle, adapt, overcome, and when possible, make friends with the local predators, because that is literally what their ancestors did with wolves. Dean Korthak slumped in his chair, a gesture that looked particularly defeated given his species' normally rigid posture. So you are telling me that we sent a human to a death world, expecting him to suffer, and instead we gave him exactly the kind of environment where human evolution has optimized them to excel. Precisely. Myra confirmed. A junior administrator raised a tentative hand. Could we not simply extract him early and claim the punishment has been served, minimize the attention, and move forward? Velka shook her head. The transmissions are scheduled automatically, even if we extract them. The videos will continue to upload from the communications array's buffer storage, and any attempt to silence him now will only generate more attention and accusations of censorship. Threnis brought up another concern. There is also the matter of coalition law. Torres has committed no crime. His punishment was meant to be educational. And if we extract him against his will when he is clearly not in danger, we violate the Academy's own charter regarding cadet rights. Against his will, repeated Korthak slowly. You think he would refuse extraction? Everyone in the room nodded, because they had all seen the expression on Jake's face in his most recent transmission. The look of someone who had found exactly where they belonged. The meeting continued for hours as they debated options, analyzed scenarios, and gradually came to the uncomfortable realization that they had lost control of the narrative entirely. Jake Torres was no longer just a cadet serving punishment. He had become a symbol, a demonstration of human capability that was causing ripples throughout the Coalition's understanding of death worlds and the species that evolved on them. Meanwhile, the transmissions kept coming. Jake's ninth video showed him constructing a more permanent shelter using techniques he claimed were based on basic camping knowledge from Earth. The shelter was weatherproof, well-insulated, and featured a ventilation system that would have impressed professional engineers. His 10th transmission documented 3 different species of fish-equivalent creatures in the Amber River, complete with notes on their behavior patterns, feeding habits, and which ones were safe to eat. The 11th showed him harvesting and preparing local plants, creating what he called a pretty decent vegetable stir-fry, using a heated rock and some salvaged metal from the shuttle's non-essential components. By the 12th transmission, Nyx had been joined by 2 more dusk renders, who Jake had named Shadow and Ember, based on their slightly different bioluminescent patterns. They are siblings. Jake explained to the camera while the three massive predators lounged around his expanded camp like oversized guard. Dogs Nix brought them by about 4 days ago, and we went through this whole introduction process, lots of sniffing, some posturing, eventually mutual acceptance. I think the fact that I had helped Nix got communicated somehow because they seemed to already know I was okay. He demonstrated how the Dusk Renders had integrated into his routine, with each one taking shifts, watching the perimeter while the others rested. They hunt at night mostly, and they have been bringing back kills to share. I think it is their way of contributing to the pack, which I guess I'm part of now. Jake showed the camera a map he had been constructing of the local area, with marked territories for different predator species, safe routes through the forest, fishing spots along the river, and areas to avoid due to unstable ground or particularly aggressive wildlife. I have been thinking about writing a proper survival guide for Kalo 7, he mused, because honestly, this place is not nearly as bad as everyone says once you understand the rules. No worse than camping in Alaska or the Amazon, just with different challenges. The video that finally broke the Academy's remaining composure showed Jake calmly documenting a territorial dispute between two different apex predator species while sitting in a tree about 15 meters above the conflict. So right now there is a Ridgeback pack leader and what I have been calling a hammerjaw, big reptilian thing with a head like an anvil, and they are sorting out whose territory this waterhole belongs to. The camera captured the two creatures circling each other, displaying threat postures that would have sent any sane coalition species fleeing in terror. My strategy here is just staying really still and not making eye contact until they sort it out themselves. Getting involved would be bad for everyone. And up here, I am not part of the equation. He narrated the confrontation like a nature documentary host, explaining the meaning behind different postures and vocalizations, predicting actions before they happen based on subtle behavioral cues. When the dispute finally resolved with the hammerjaw conceding territory and retreating, Jake climbed down from his perch with casual ease. And that is why you always scout water sources before committing to using them. Territorial boundaries change, and you do not want to be filling your water bottles when the local predators are having property disagreements. Back at the Academy, the review committee had expanded to include representatives from the Coalition Council itself. They watched Jake's latest transmission in silence, and when it ended, the Council's senior xenobiological advisor spoke. We need to completely revise our approach to Death World classification and to human integration into Coalition space. What we are seeing here is not an outlier or an exception. It is a demonstration of baseline human capability. Dean Korthax looked around the room at faces representing a dozen different species, all showing various expressions of shock, concern, and in some cases, something like recommendations. He asked, simply. The Coalition military observer spoke first. We should be training humans for Death World exploration and research. This represents a massive opportunity to access resources, and the extraction shuttle descended through Kalo 7's atmosphere exactly 90 days after Jake Torres had first landed, following protocols that specified punishment assignments must end precisely at their scheduled conclusion. The pilot was a veteran Velkari named Sekin who had volunteered for the extraction duty, partly out of curiosity, and partly because he did not believe half of what the transmissions had shown. He expected to find either a broken human begging for rescue, or more likely, given the nature of Kalo 7, no human at all, and a camp destroyed by the local wildlife. What he found instead made him request immediate verification from the Academy that he had the correct coordinates. The clearing where Jake had originally landed was no longer recognizable as the same location. What had been a simple emergency shelter pod had evolved into something resembling a small research station, complete with multiple structures built from local materials that showed sophisticated engineering and an understanding of the planet's weather patterns. There were covered storage areas, a smoking rack for preserving meat, a garden plot where Jake had apparently been experimenting with cultivating local plants, and a fire pit surrounded by log benches that suggested he had been expecting company. Jake himself stood in the center of the compound, looking healthier than when he had left the academy. He had clearly gained muscle mass from the higher gravity and constant physical activity. His skin had taken on a tan from Kalo 7's sun, and he wore clothing that was a mixture of his original academy uniform and pieces he had fashioned from local materials. What really stopped Sekim's primary heart, however, was the escort Nyx stood at Jake's right shoulder, her obsidian scales gleaming in the purple-tinged light, and her bioluminescent patterns pulsing in what the pilot would later learn was her relaxed state shadow. An ember flanked them like honor guards, and behind them Sekim could see at least 4 more dusk renders lounging around the compound. Permission to come aboard, Jake called out cheerfully as the shuttle's ramp lowered, as if this were a routine pickup and not an extraction from one of the most dangerous planets in known space. Sekim activated the external speakers with a hand that trembled slightly despite his years of experience. Cadet Torres, you are ordered to board immediately for return transport to the academy. Jake nodded and turned to Nyx, placing his hand on her massive head in a gesture that looked both casual and deeply affectionate. He spoke to her in what sounded like a mixture of English and sounds that approximated the dusk render's own vocalizations, and the great predator made a rumbling sound that seemed like protest. I know, Jake said, his voice carrying clearly in the still air. I know, but I have to go back. It is only temporary, though. I promise I will come back to visit. He moved among the other dusk renders, touching each one and speaking quietly. And to Sekim's utter amazement, the deadly predators responded with clear signs of distress at his departure. Nyx, in particular, kept positioning herself between Jake and the shuttle, her bioluminescent patterns flashing in sequences that even Sekim could recognize as agitation. It took Jake nearly 20 minutes to say his goodbyes, and when he finally walked up the shuttle's ramp, his eyes were suspiciously bright. Nyx followed him to the base of the ramp and made a sound that was somewhere between a whine and a howl, and Jake had to turn away quickly as the ramp closed. The flight back to the academy station was conducted in near silence. Askin kept glancing at his passenger, trying to reconcile the confident young man with the supposed punishment case, who should have been traumatized by 3 months of isolation on a death world. May I ask a question, Cadet? Sekim finally ventured when they were clear of the atmosphere. Sure, Jake replied, staring out the viewport at the planet shrinking behind them. The dusk renders the one you call Nyx, especially. How did you know she would not simply kill you when you freed her from the burrow? Jake was quiet for a moment, considering the question. I did not know for certain, he admitted, but I looked at her and I saw the same intelligence I would see in an earth animal in distress. Fear, yes, but also calculation. She was weighing her options just like I was weighing mine. He turned from the viewport to look at the pilot. My ancestors survived because they learned to see other predators not just as threats, but as potential allies. We domesticated wolves into dogs. We learned to work with horses. We even figured out how to coexist with lions and bears by understanding their behavior. Jake smiled slightly. Nyx is not that different from a wolf. Really, she is smart. She understands pack dynamics. She can recognize when someone is trying to help rather than harm. The fact that she is 3 meters tall and can bite through armor does not change the fundamental psychology. Sekim found himself nodding despite his species' natural aversion to such logic. And you truly believe you can return to visit? I do not just believe it. I am planning it, Jake said with certainty. Nyx is going to have pups in about 6 months based on my observations of her behavior and biological signs. I want to be there for that. And I want to document it because, as far as I know, no one has ever observed dusk render reproduction and early development. The pilot made a note to inform the Academy that their extraction had not cured the human of his attachment to the death world. If anything, it seemed to have strengthened it. The arrival at the Academy station was nothing like Jake's departure had been, where before he had walked alone through empty corridors to receive his punishment. Now he found crowds of cadets and even some instructors lying. The docking bay news of his return had spread through the Academy's rumor network faster than official communications ever traveled. And many wanted to catch a glimpse of the human who had tamed the death world. Jake handled the attention with surprising grace, answering questions when asked, but mostly just trying to make his way to the debriefing he had been told was mandatory. The debriefing room was the same one where he had received his punishment 3 months earlier. But the atmosphere could not have been more different. Dean Korthak sat at the center of the panel, flanked by Velkus, Professor Mira, and several administrators Jake did not recognize, including what appeared to be a Coalition Council representative, Cadet Torres. Korthak began, his voice carefully neutral. Welcome back. I trust your assignment was educational. Jake recognized the loaded nature of that question and considered his response carefully. Sir, it was the most valuable learning experience of my life, he said honestly. I learned more about xenobiology, survival strategy, and environmental adaptation in 3 months on Kalo 7 than I have in 2 years of academy classes. He paused, then added, no disrespect to the curriculum intended. Velkus leaned forward, her 4 eyes studying him intently. We have reviewed all of your transmissions, and we have questions, many questions. But first, we need to address the matter of your original violations. She pulled up a holographic display showing his unauthorized simulation modifications. Do you understand why these actions were considered problematic? Jake nodded slowly. I understand that they violated established protocols and created liability concerns for the Academy. What I did not understand before Kalo 7 was that those protocols exist not because they are the only way to do things, but because they are the safe way for most coalition species. He met Velkus' gaze directly. Humans have different risk tolerance and different capabilities. We need different protocols. Not because the existing ones are wrong, but because they are optimized for species with different evolutionary backgrounds. The Coalition Council representative spoke for the first time, a voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. That is a remarkably mature observation. Cadet, it is also the same conclusion that our xenobiology experts reached after extensive analysis of your transmissions. She brought up new displays showing policy documents. The Coalition is implementing changes to how we approach Death World classification and human training. Your, shall we call it performance, on Kalo 7 has demonstrated that our previous assumptions were fundamentally flawed. Professor Mira added, we are also in the process of declassifying much of the research data from Kalo 7. Your observations have provided more useful information about that ecosystem than 2 centuries of failed research expeditions. Jake blinked in surprise. Does this mean I am not in trouble anymore? Korthak made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. Cadet Torres, you have become the most famous Academy student in Coalition history. Your fishing vlogs have been viewed over 2 billion times across the network. Various human governments are demanding we provide you with proper recognition for your contributions to xenobiological research. The dean paused, then continued. You are not in trouble. In fact, we are offering you a position in the newly formed Death World Research Initiative, which will focus on exploring and documenting planets previously considered too hostile for Coalition presence. Jake felt excitement building, but forced himself to ask the important question, would this position allow me to return to Kalo 7? We were hoping you would want to, Myra said, with what looked like relief. We need a long-term observation post there. And you have already established the infrastructure and local relationships, if you agree. We will provide proper equipment, support staff, and official recognition of your work. Jake did not hesitate. I accept.